Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose hosts hundreds of in person events along with our partnered and supported events, trips, and classes, some of which are held at our branches at Union Market and at the Wharf. So please check our website for a full list. A couple of housekeeping items before we start. Number one, please turn off or silence your cell phone so as not to disturb the event. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone over here by the pillar before asking your questions to ensure that not only the question is recorded, but to also ensure that it is being heard and enjoyed by the group. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them right out front by the cash registers. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, please line up again by the pillar over here. And we will come by to ask if you need personalization, so have your books ready for us. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. So, I am honored to introduce Sidney Morrison to all of you. He is a retired teacher and school principal who now serves as a part time educational consultant and leadership coach for school leaders in school districts in Southern California. He also provides professional development and workshops about ethical leadership and diversity equity issues in schools. Before retiring, he worked in the public schools for 36 years, serving as a history and English teacher, then as an assistant principal, and then principal. Elected to the board of directors of the Association of California School Administrations, representing the LA South Bay area, he was then elected as state president for 1998 and 1999. He is proud of Access recognition of his leadership through two major awards. He is also proud of the Bronze Star earned as a medical corpsman assisting the wounded in a minefield during the Vietnam War. Tonight, he will be talking about his new book, Frederick Douglass, a Novel. In this vivid and rich portrayal of one of America's most important figures, Sidney goes beyond Douglass as the revered public figure and includes intimate details of Douglass's personal life, including, and most importantly, the women in his orbit. The end result is a novel that offers a complete portrayal of the man who dedicated his life to the cause of racial equality and to the abolition of slavery. Everyone, let us all welcome Sidney Morrison.
I'm also hello everybody. Thank you for coming. Considering that what's happening in this country this evening, I am especially honored that you chose to be here tonight because you have so many other places that you could be, and so I really appreciate your being here. I would like to point out because when you're an author of a book, you're encouraged to self-promote and talk about your work. And I just want to share one other item, which is something that was written by the Christian Science Monitor Weekly. And the reviewer, Aaron Douglas, not related to Frederick Douglass, noted, author Sidney Morrison sets out to excavate the man from the calcified layers of myth. The results are a meticulously researched novel that gives voice to Douglas' kith and kin and enables his complexity and contradictions to roar from the page. That was very satisfying to hear. And then she says, Frederick Douglass, a novel, is a chunk of a book, dense with history and brimming with the details of a life fully lived. Be warned, it's 682 pages. I want to encourage you to, if you wish to have a book signed, to come forward, and I will give you also a bookmark that has a code on it where you can access my website, sydneymorrison.com, where you can get information as to where I will be throughout the country because I'm going east to the Eastern Shore next month, and I'm really excited about going to Easton, where Frederick Douglass was jailed. Um, and so let me begin by telling you what I wrote about. My goal is to inspire you to buy and read my novel about a man who was called the prophet of freedom, the clarion voice, liberty's champion. Except for a graphic novel published in 2018, my book is the first traditional historical novel about Frederick Douglass since 1947, the year of my birth. Using a popular literary genre, the historical novel, I hope to introduce Frederick Douglass to a wide audience and deepen our understanding of a remarkable man by revealing his complexity and contradictions. There is a question worth pursuing. This is a question I pose to you. How do we become our true selves in a society that inhibits, narrows options, deny choice, punish when we step out of roles assigned to us? I could have answered this question as a biographer, but there are excellent biographies available, including the splendid 2018 biography by David Blight. But biographers are constrained by documentation. Assertions must be validated by evidence. On the other hand, I wanted to take the imaginative leap after immersing myself in the documentation of Douglass's era, reading diaries, letters, newspapers, and travel back in time to hear dead people talking in private conversations. I needed to explore domestic life behind the curtain of formality, discretion, and secrets to fill in the gaps often deliberately created. For example, when Douglass secretly married his white secretary, a woman 20 years younger, and Douglass's children learned about it from a reporter, they confronted their father. According to their letters, we know Frederick demanded that his children respect his second wife, according to his letters. But what did they say during this remarkable family intervention? I wanted to do more than narrate these lives. I wanted to dramatize them, scene by scene, with dialogue from multiple points of view, a series of mirrors focusing on Douglass without Douglass always holding the mirror and exclusively telling his story. I was especially interested in the lives of the female characters in the life of Frederick Douglass, all strong women who shaped him in multiple ways. But who was Frederick Douglass? We know that he was an escaped slave. We know that he was a writer and orator, the most famous critic of slavery and discrimination in the 19th century. He attracted crowds of thousands, and I mean thousands. He produced millions of words and speeches, sometimes 2-hour, 3-hour speeches, essays, editorials, and autobiographies. He advised presidents from Lincoln to Grover Cleveland. His words resounded through the years, challenging us, inspiring us. For example, right is of no sex. Without struggle, there is no progress. What is the 4th of July to the American slave? Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. I would unite with anybody to do right. The white man's happiness cannot be purchased by the black man's misery. The cause of humanity is won the world over. Human rights are eternal, universal, and indestructible. Agitate, agitate, agitate. He loved language. He collected words. He studied the Bible, memorizing pages of the Old and New Testament. He loved Shakespeare, read Dickens, his two favorites, completely self-taught. He never went to a school one day in his life. He bought his first book when he was 12 years old in Baltimore, The Columbian Orator, a book of speeches about freedom and liberty recited by boys on the streets of Baltimore for class assignments. Its collector, Caleb Bingham, wrote an introductory essay about speech making. Frederick kept this little book for the rest of his life, studying how to give speeches, memorizing lines to include in his own. By the time he emerged as a public figure, he was so polished, so eloquent, A correspondent to the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, noted after a Douglass lecture, I quote, "Many persons in the audience seemed unable to credit the statements which he gave of himself and could not believe that he was actually a slave. How a man only 6 years out of bondage and who had never gone to school a day in his life could speak with such eloquence, with such precision of language and power of thought. They were utterly at a loss to devise." Even some of his white colleagues suggested that he speak less formally and add plantation talk to his stories for greater authenticity. He refused, and to prove his authenticity, he wrote a book instead, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Naming his enslavers, describing his birthplace, telling stories about his family and how they lived on the eastern shore of Maryland and in Baltimore. He transformed his life into literary art, producing a masterpiece of autobiography. I believe the greatest autobiography of the 19th century, a work that can stand with the other masterpieces of that mid-century era, Moby Dick, The Scarlet Letter, Walden, Leaves of Grass. It is, in my opinion, his greatest accomplishment. It changed his life. He became famous, but it forced him to flee his country. And he feared that he might not ever return. But that flight gave him a vision of possibility. He found a land, Great Britain, where he was not despised or discriminated against. His color did not matter, and slavery had been abolished a decade before. Although his native land did not love him, Frederick Douglass loved America and wanted to return. It was his home. His family was there. But he was a fugitive, subject to arrest and return to his enslaver, because slavery in 1846 was still legal and a foundation of the nation's economy. His New English friends, readers of his book, and listeners to his many speeches raised money to purchase his freedom from his enslaver. And after a price was negotiated and settled, he received the document of his emancipation, the news of his emancipation on Christmas Eve, 1846. The actual document of manumission arrived a few weeks later. Words matter. They can change lives. They can change the world. Just imagine a verbal genius who was born a slave, escapes and becomes the most famous Black man in the world, writing books, editing newspapers, giving speeches, advising presidents, and returns to Maryland, where he was born, to reunite with his former enslavers. Who can resist such a great adventure story? I couldn't. And over the course of 40 years, I wrote 3 versions. The first one in longhand before there were computers. And I had to pay someone to type up the manuscript. And when it was finally done, it was 1,000 pages. I had to write it again and again, edit, rewrite, cut. And this version is the 3rd version of that process. And my oldest son said to me, "Dad, aren't you lucky the first 2 versions were rejected?" And I said, yes, because this is the better version. It took 40 years, a lesson in persistence. But it was also a lesson in responding to a great adventure. It is not just a physical adventure. It is also a moral, intellectual, and spiritual adventure. I'm referring to Frederick Douglass's life. It was an amazing adventure. He struggled with organized religion and challenged ministers, Black and white, throughout his long life. He changed his mind, at first believing, like William Lloyd Garrison, that enslavers could be morally persuaded of the sin of slavery and free their slaves. Reluctantly, he turned to politics as the solution, and then to slave rebellion and war as a means to liberate his people, eventually discovering that emancipation was easier to achieve than equality. Racism was a virulent disease then. It remains a virulent disease now, poisoning inner lives and the body of the nation. He was a creature of will and ambition, creating his public image. He regularly gave a speech called The Self-Made Man. But he denied the myth of the self-made man, saying, there are no such men as self-made men. That term implies an individual independence of the past and the present, which can never exist. He insisted that we are creations of our will and also the result of our interaction with others. The community and the community's history shapes us in ways great and small. As James Baldwin observed, history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. Douglass also noted, men seldom see themselves as others see them. There are moments in the lives of most men when the doors of their souls are open, and consciously to themselves, their true characters may be read by the observant eye. As a novelist, I believe I have observant eyes, and I know we are the stories we tell, the stories we hear, the stories we repeat, the stories we want to believe, the lies we tell ourselves. We all have stories. A controlling man, Douglass needed to control and shape the narrative of his public life, especially because he considered himself the representative Black man of his era, the best that his time and place had reduced. And so to control that narrative, he wrote 3 autobiographies. The narrative of life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave in 1845, My Bondage and My Freedom in 1855, and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass in 1881. If you read his books, you will notice omissions, gaps. For example, revelations about his private domestic life. Sometimes these omissions are glaring. For example, Anna, his wife of 44 years, is rarely mentioned. In fact, over the course of 3 books, 2 quite long, the last 2, he gave her a total of 3 sentences. What is that about? Why did he do this? Was he a public figure insisting on protecting his privacy? Or was he hiding or ashamed of the fact that Anna was illiterate and never learned to read or write? Douglass also used the new technology of his time, photography, to shape the narrative of his life, becoming the most photographed American of the 19th century. Soon as technology was created, he was in studios getting his picture taken. He was well aware of his physical appearance and presence, the impact he had on others, especially women. He was tall, 6'2" when the average height of American men was 5'8". He was handsome with high cheekbones. He was muscular with a barrel chest and broad shoulders. He packed weights, by the way, when he traveled on his lecture tours, weighing over 200 pounds since adolescence. He had a deep bass baritone voice, and he could sing. From everything I've heard, he could sing well, and he could project over thousands. And he was always impeccably dressed. He rarely smiled in photos and looked directly into the camera with piercing eyes. The message was clear. I am a man to be reckoned with. You must take me seriously. But the early photographs did not always reveal his light complexion, often making him darker than he was. With improvements in their technology, these photographs became more realistic. He was biracial, and he declared openly, my father was a white man in his narrative. But sometimes he also had illustrators darken his skin. As a novelist, I believe, we are mysteries to each other. We reveal what we choose, and despite our masks, reveal ourselves anyway. We are seen by others what they want to see. We are seen by the roles we assume and by the roles others assign to us. This is the stuff of drama and comedy, in my opinion, and the characters drive the story. We read novels for the characters. We want to know them, travel with them on their journey of discovery of themselves and their worlds. So you'll get to know certain people in Frederick Douglass' novel. For example, Betsy Bailey, his grandmother, who raised him blissfully ignorant of his condition of enslavement for 6 years. She had 5 daughters and several grandchildren who rotated in and out of the cabin and lived on other farms. Only Frederick was allowed to stay with her. And then one day she woke him up for a 15-mile walk east to a huge plantation and left him there without warning or explanation. Why did she do this? Was Frederick traumatized? Read my book and find out. Captain Aaron Anthony, the chief overseer of Y Plantation, the largest estate on the eastern shore of Maryland. Anthony was Frederick's master and owner. It was whispered that he was Frederick's father. Was he? What impact did he have on a 6-year-old precocious child when Frederick witnessed Anthony whipping Frederick's Aunt Hester because she was caught sleeping with another slave? Read my book to find out. Colonel Edward Lloyd and his family. Colonel Lloyd owned Y Plantation and hundreds of slaves, and he selected Frederick to be the companion of his youngest son, Daniel. Why? Surrounded by the splendor of great wealth in a magnificent house still standing on the eastern shore, Frederick lived there off and on for only 2 years. But for the rest of his life, he described the Lloyd family and their way of life in books and speeches as representatives of the cruelties of slavery. Then he returned to White House in 1879 as a distinguished visitor received by a direct descendant of Colonel Lloyd. Did White House and the Lloyd family affect Frederick's sense of self as a man of property and standing? And why did he return there when he didn't have to? Read my book. Sophia Old. When Frederick was sent to Baltimore as a loan, she taught him his letters because, as a religious woman, she wanted him to read the Bible. When she learned teaching him how to read was illegal and dangerous, she tried to hide newspapers and books, but her fear revealed the power of words to this little boy, and Frederick turned to his white street friends and bribed them with stolen biscuits to identify words and signs on walls. And yet, years later, when Maryland abolished slavery in 1864, Frederick returned to see her. Why? Read my book. Anna Murray, a free black, 5 years older than Frederick. She helped him escape, married him, and stayed with him for 44 years, even though Frederick insisted that his 2 white female friends at different times lived in their house, even as rumors swirled that he was their lover. Who was Anna Murray, described by Frederick as the pillar of his life, and how did she deal with these friendships? Maria Weston Chapman. Raise your hand if you ever heard of Maria Weston Chapman. She was the executive director during the work of the New England and Massachusetts anti-slavery societies, called the Duchess by her enemies because she wielded power behind the public face of the male leaders like Garrison. She raised the money, planned the speaking tours, made assignments. When Frederick revealed plans to start his own newspaper, she worked to destroy his career. Why, and how did she do it? Interesting enough, Douglass observed, when the true story of the anti-slavery cause shall be written, women will occupy a large space in its pages, for the cause of the slave has been peculiarly a woman's cause. Julius Girthis, his white English friend, who helped to purchase his freedom and then came to America to help him edit his paper and raise money for it. Why did he insist on traveling with her, attending meetings with her, walking the streets at great risk to their safety and his? In 1849, a mob attacked Frederick when he walked with Julia and her sister in Battery Park. He wrote about the attack, but was not deterred. He kept on insisting that he was equal, and he would go to restaurants and hotels just to stir things up. Was she in love with him? Did they become lovers? How did Anna Douglass feel about Julia living in her house? Attilia Assing, a German journalist who came to Frederick's Rochester house for 3 and 4 months every summer for 20 years. Visited him in his Washington home, staying for weeks at a time in a designated room that was just for her. And when Frederick came to New York for meetings, he stayed at her boarding house in a room specifically set aside for him. Were they lovers? And why and how did Anna deal with Attilia's annual visits? Read my book. Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Those are names you probably recognize. These were suffragists who became close friends with Frederick, who was the only Black man at the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, and one of the few men willing to sign his name calling for women's suffrage. His newspaper proclaimed right is of no sex, and yet they became bitter enemies after the war during the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to only male citizens. They were furious. What happened? Helen Pitts, his second wife, his secretary, 20 years younger, as I said. Why did she marry Frederick? And how did she handle the opposition of Frederick's family, her family that disowned her, and the white and Black communities in 1886, both who were opposed because interracial marriage was illegal and unpopular in most of the country. There are many other characters that influenced Frederick in multiple ways. I tried to give them all their backstories, and the novel was over 1,000 pages as a result, so I had to cut pages, in fact, entire chapters. But there were a few other characters I would wish to highlight before I open it up for questions. Thomas Old, Frederick's legal owner after the death of Aaron Anthony. He sent Frederick to Baltimore as a loan to his brother, Thomas. Thomas ordered Frederick back to the Eastern Shore after a dispute between the two brothers. Thomas ordered Frederick back to the Eastern Shore, beat him, and then hired a man to break Frederick's adolescent cocky spirit. He was a teenager to be reckoned with. When Frederick started a school for slaves to read, Thomas led a group to break up the school. And when Frederick tried to escape and was caught and almost lynched, Thomas did something entirely unexpected, actually shocking. What did Thomas Old do? Read my book and answer the question, why did he do this? Edward Covey, emotionally and physically abusing Frederick for months. Covey almost drove Frederick to suicide. And then one day, unable to take any more abuse, Frederick fought back, deciding he would die before allowing this man or anyone else to beat him again. They fought for hours. And then Covey gave up, never touching Frederick again. Why did he do this? And how did this year, especially that fight, change Frederick? He said it changed him profoundly. Read my book, and you will discover the significance of this year with Edward Covey. William Lloyd Garrison, that's a name you probably recognize. He was the founder of the Liberator who mentored Frederick, calling him in private letters, the lion amongst us. Then when Frederick changed his mind about the US Constitution, a constitution called by Garrison as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, Garrison publicly attacked Frederick, creating the most virulent public dispute in the history of American abolition. Garrison never forgave Frederick, calling him an apostate, a traitor. Was Frederick Douglass a traitor and an apostate? You decide that reading the book. Henry Highland Garnet, another name you probably don't recognize. He was a Black preacher who gave what Frederick thought at the time was the greatest speech he had ever heard, a call for slave rebellion, which Frederick then moved to suppress as too dangerous for public print. Garnet hated Frederick for the rest of his life. Did Frederick have a gift for making enemies? Was he a hypocrite, an ambitious schemer, as Garnet accused him of being? John Brown, a name you probably recognize. John Douglas, he was Douglas's white friend who planned multiple slave rebellions. Douglas supported him, introducing him to other Black leaders, raising money, providing shelter in his home for weeks at a time. But Frederick abandoned Brown when Brown, changing plans, invited him to join him for the attack on Harper's Ferry. Frederick said, this is suicidal. No. Why did Brown bring letters from Douglas and other supporters to Harper's Ferry, forcing Douglas to flee the country when Brown was captured and then ultimately executed? Was Brown a fanatic, a madman, a liar, or a hero who hastened the start of the Civil War? Abraham Lincoln, the president who received harsh criticism from Douglass until Douglass met Lincoln in the summer of 1863, after Douglass met with other black leaders, after Lincoln, met with other black leaders and called for black immigration and blamed the presence of black people as a cause for the Civil War. This was from Lincoln. Was Lincoln a white supremacist? And if so, why was Douglass devastated by Lincoln's assassination and said he was a great man who saved the nation? Later in 1876, before President Grant, his cabinet, the Supreme Court, and congressmen assembled, Douglass called Lincoln the white man's president. What was Douglass's relationship with Abraham Lincoln, who summoned Douglass to Washington for his advice and said Douglass was his friend? Read my book. Ulysses S. Grant, we have a few more. Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero responsible for the surrender of Robert E. Lee, became the 18th president of the United States for 2 terms. Douglass worked zealously for his 2 elections and expected Grant to reward him with a government post. Why did Grant refuse to do this? And why, when Grant's administration became mired in scandal, did Frederick Douglass essentially remain silent? Charles Sumner, senator of Massachusetts, probably most famous because he was beaten by a congressman on the floor of the Senate in 1856. Douglass's friend was an ardent supporter of civil rights, and his Bill of Civil Rights of 1876, banning discrimination in public life, was passed by Congress and then overturned by the Supreme Court. Sumner was an unrelenting critic of President Grant and his corrupt administration, and started a third party to undermine Grant's reelection. A loyal Republican, Douglass opposed Sumner and lost his friendship. Was Douglass so ambitious he was willing to overlook corruption and abuse within his own party? Was he so ambitious for a job he was unwilling to publicly criticize Ulysses S. Grant? There are so many other characters I can name and describe, but I will leave it you to discover them in my book. He criticized America, but he loved his country. He believed in the promise of America, the promise of freedom, justice, equality. We are his children. But today some ask, who is an American? Douglass answered this question unequivocally in a speech he gave on December 7, 1869 in Boston, when the country was roiled by a wave of racism and xenophobia directed against Chinese immigrants. California, where I reside, lived this story. Until recently, the story was not told, erased from books, even photographs. Look at the pictures of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. There are white people standing on those trains because the Chinese were told to not be in the picture. Douglass noted, already has California assumed a bitterly unfriendly attitude toward the Chinese. Already she has driven them from their altars of justice. Already has she stamped them as outcasts and handed them over to popular contempt and vulgar jests. Already are they the constant victims of cruel harshness and brutal violence. And his response to this was calling for a shift in perspective, an acceptance of a grander vision of America and humanity, a recognition that love is not just personal. Love is communal and finds its grandest, highest expression in justice for all. America is a composite nation, he insisted. The world is one world. He explained, there are such things in the world as human rights. They are eternal, universal, and indestructible. The rights of migration, the right which belongs to no particular race, belongs alike to all and all alike. I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity. And when there is a supposed conflict between human and national rights, it is safe to go to the side of humanity. He urged America to make itself the perfect national illustration of unity and dignity of the human family that the world has ever seen. He urged America to become this. He warned, however, of the dangers of religious uniformity. He did not want America to become a Christian nation. He refused to thank God for the 15th Amendment when a delegation of black ministers insisted that he do so. He demanded the removal of Bibles from schools. He declared, I know of no church, however tolerant, of no priesthood, however enlightened, which could be safely trusted with the tremendous power of which universal conformity would confer. We should welcome all men of every shade of religious opinion as among the best means of checking the arrogance and intolerance which are the almost inevitable concomitant of general conformity. He was a man for the ages, flaws and all. As lovers of freedom, we are all his sons and daughters. So let us celebrate what he represents, possibility, the promise of the best that we can be. You will discover this great, complicated man in my novel. He enraptured me. I hope he enraptures you. Thank you. And now I'm going to take a picture of your smiling faces. Thank you so much. My publicist says that I have to, even though it's live streamed, I got to send pictures. So, questions and answers. And remember, if you have a question, you need to come forward to the microphone and ask the question so that everyone can hear it. Yes, please come forward.
I know that Frederick Douglass has living descendants who are very attractive. I've seen them.
Yes.
And I suppose one or two of them are scholars of their ancestor. Did you talk to them, and did you get a sense of an ongoing personality or anything
No,
from
I didn't
them?
talk to them. And some of those descendants live in Los Angeles, and I reached out to them, and they were not interested in talking with me. I don't know why, but we have a descendant here in the room, actually. And I am sorry if I called you out, but yeah, he's a descendant of Douglass's family through Anna Murray. So there's one of the things that about biography as compared to historical fiction, which will address this issue. There are some within or without the family who feel that these elements of controversy should not be brought up publicly because they cannot be definitively determined. For example, there's no smoking gun letter coming from Frederick Douglass that says, I had this affair. Now, with Attilia Assing, the German, she wrote voluminous letters to her sister, which have been translated in English, and she is quite detailed in her declarations of what happened in their relationship. But I'm a novelist, and I wanted to take that leap of what if. I'm making no claim that this is definitive story. I am hoping that more books and biographies are written about Frederick Douglass. I, believe there should be more novels. If you go to a bookstore, perhaps this one, I believe that, as many historians, that Frederick Douglass was one of two greatest Americans of the 19th century. You can find shelves about Abraham Lincoln, but not about Frederick Douglass. So I'm hoping, if nothing else, that this will begin a resurgence of interest in Frederick Douglass, his books, and his life. And he wrote voluminous letters. I have them all his speeches, I have them all, because I wanted to immerse myself into his life. But I'm hoping one day that I'll have a conversation and talk with members of the family. I'm going to Rochester next month, and Frederick Douglass is buried there, and there are libraries named after him. And so I'm really excited. When I went to the Eastern Shore a few years ago, I was just like a kid in a candy store. It was just being in the space that he lived, and I never seen the Chesapeake Bay until I crossed that bridge, and I felt for the first time why he loved Maryland so much. And he said, it's not that I loved Maryland less, but I loved freedom more. That's why he left. But he came back, and he connected with some of his family when he returned. And in fact, he discovered his brother, who had been separated for 50 years, and brought him back to live in Rochester with him. So it's a very inspiring, complicated story because his children, for example, were appalled that their uncle was a former slave who was illiterate, and their ostracism was so great that his brother Perry moved back to Maryland, where he died. Not no,
Sounds
where he went to live, and then Frederick went to Maryland to bring him back to Rochester, and that's where he died. But there was real tension within families. Families are complicated, right?
sounds like a wonderful book. There's a wonderful thing everybody can access, which is very young people from children to college age.
Yes. Mhm.
His descendants reading the Fourth of July
Oh, yes.
letter, and it's fabulous.
It's one of the greatest speeches ever written. However, you should be warned. That section, when he talks about the 4th of July, is in a 25-page speech about a lot of other things. And so most people get that 1.5 pages. But he said he always hated giving short speeches. And so but those elements of those speeches are absolutely brilliant, absolutely eloquent, and justifiably famous. And I believe, and it's now in many parts of the country, it's now a tradition and to print that speech because it's a call for America to live up to its ideals. Yes, please come forward.
So I was initially going to ask, did writing this book change you? But I'm going to make the assumption that it did change
Yes.
you and ask how it changed you.
How it changed me. I discovered Frederick Douglass through this book when I was in college as a student of history. But as I felt inspired to do more, my first impulse in writing a novel was to think I could write a better autobiography. So I wrote the first version as a first-person improvement of the autobiographies he had written. And now when I think about how complicated a man he was and the life he lived, I realized that was ineffective, and so I set that aside and wrote a multiple point of view story because I wanted to bring life, especially to the people he did not speak about as much, like his wife Anna, who turned out to be my favorite character because she was the truth teller, at least in my assessment. And so I changed in my relationship to Frederick in that he became a human being in his complexity, in his contradictions, because at first he was an iconic figure who was unassailable for criticism. And I felt emboldened to tell his story in multiple ways, and I was changed as a result. And because I believe that writing books can be and should be an effort at empathy, to understand what you cannot know. Hilary Mantel, who's a great historical novelist, said, you should write about what you don't know, because by doing so, you extend your capacity for understanding. And as a result, I can say, I think I'm now more empathetic, more accepting of contradiction and complexity. We're all complex. We all have contradictions. We all have secrets. And so accepting that in Frederick Douglass, I found that it affected my perception of other human beings. Thank you. And there's a gentleman, you were waiting for your question.
Yeah, thanks so much for the wonderful presentation about your book.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, why do you think Frederick Douglass never gave up on the promise of America, even though he had good reason to do so?
Right.
And then also, on a more personal level, how were you able to stick with this book over 40 years?
I was inspired. I just felt that Douglass's life deserved a retelling in a way that would become more accessible to the public. And excuse me, when I first wrote the first two versions, people commended me for my research and for my writing style. But at the time, they said these, and I have multiple rejection letters to prove it. They would say, Frederick Douglass, who cares? Abolitionism, that's passé. And so there was this sense of time. And I just waited because I knew that eventually his time would come. that people would see that issues of race and the relevance and the issues that he talked about would be things that would attract attention. And so now, after those 40 years, I think I've been vindicated that he speaks to our moment. And he is now being quoted over and over again. And because he speaks so clearly of his relevance to America. And his question about Frederick's perception of America, this may sound simplistic or cliche. He believed in the promise of America. He believed the Declaration of Independence. He believed that the Constitution which said that we are the people and that we're creating a nation. He believed it. And he got noticed because the first time he spoke publicly, it was against a movement called colonization, which, led by people like Henry Clay and other people who said the solution to race was that all Black people leave. And he, from the very moment he heard about this, he said, I'm an American and I'm not leaving. And he told Lincoln that when Lincoln said this to a group of Black people. He was not there at the time, but a year later he met Lincoln and he told them, we're not leaving. This is our country. We're American too. And he stayed consistently with that. And by the time he got older, he started to expand his perception of his role, because he started off as someone speaking about, slavery and equality. Then he saw that his role was to be more universal. And he started speaking about war and justice and labor issues. And there were some Black leaders who said, no, you stick to our story, our cause. And this is a story that has been repeated again and again in the history of protest. Happened to Martin Luther King. It happens when you become more universal. Some people feel that's a diminishment of their power in a cause. But he just kept on expanding his vision about what his role is. So I think that by the end of his life, he was a universal reformer. And there were the young Black leaders were so upset, and they called him a traitor to the cause. And one young man met him at a conference and said, I hate you, Frederick Douglass, I hate you. And this was very upsetting to Frederick Douglass, because those young men were possible because of the work that Frederick Douglass did before. And he wanted their appreciation, and he lost it. And so that appreciation has now come around. And so I think, again, he's been vindicated. Did that answer your questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. There's someone behind you? Yes, please.
Yeah, that was a very inspiring talk you gave about your own book.
Thank
It's
you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
This is a very picky little question.
Okay, sure.
I'm just wondering whether Douglass mentions Darwin at all.
He does, but it's not mentioned in my book, but he does talk about Darwin in his speeches. And in fact, when Douglass first started, when he began to expand his vision of what he should talk about in speeches, he started giving speeches about history and science and anthropology, and those speeches were not popular, because people said, we don't want to hear about Darwin and William of Orange and what's happening in France with their revolution. We want you to tell slave stories. And so, no, and he's not mentioned in the book, but I know that he mentioned Darwin because I have all of his speeches.
Right.
And I know that, and by the way, many of you may not know, thanks to scholars, from the moment he emerged in 1841 as an anti-slavery lecturer, we now know where he was almost every day of his public life, from 1841 until the day he died in 1895, where he was at a women's rights convention, sitting next to Susan B. Anthony, went home, describing that speech, describing that meeting, and had a heart attack. So his life was a public
Completely
life.
documented,
From the very beginning, he stepped forward and started attacking that movement about colonization. So his public life is very well documented. But I, as a novelist, wanted to talk about his private life more.
Well, thank you for doing that. I
Thank
look forward
you.
to the book. Why? Because disputes between religion and evolution were very, very hot
Very hot. And
in much of the world.
Right.
And it was very much in the background of pretty much all thinkers, whether or
yes,
not
exactly.
they took it on.
And because Douglass was so committed to the truths of science,
Yeah.
he called out the Black community in his last book, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. The last 4 pages are an attack on the religious superstition and the lack of commitment to science in the Black community. So when he was told to thank, when the 15th Amendment was passed and he thanked thank you. And the 15th Amendment was passed and they said, you're listing all these people, but you're not naming God. And he told them, God had nothing to do with this. I'm not going to thank him. So they went to the churches and blasted him for being anti-religion. And in fact, he was so critical of religion in this first book, he had to write an appendix and say, I'm not against Christianity. I'm just against Christianity used by people to justify slavery and discrimination. And so he was very clear. He said, I will not accept the whipping Christianity, the child stealing Christianity. I will accept the gospel. I will not accept your version of Christianity. And he was unequivocal about that. And he was criticized roundly in both communities, and especially when he started promoting science. And he very much was attracted to the new developments in anthropology as well. Yeah. And so he got very much more committed to the truths of science. And remember, the 19th century was still struggling with science as a valid way of perceiving reality.
Still are.
Still are. That's right. Thank you. Thank you. Sir, please come forward.
The need for a moral underpinning to change to be more in accordance with the Constitution
Yes.
and other values which are universal
Yes.
would seem to call for religion of the type that you described, the kind that the religion of the gospel, the religion of revealed by God through his manifestations, and would also seem to call for science and an adherence to that method of learning that is science.
Yes.
Now, is this clear in your thinking now that you've studied Douglass? Is it, how close are we to that realization? I mean, we pride ourselves on being a secular society, and maybe, having it right is just a matter of the right politics, but I don't believe that, and I'm wondering if
Well,
how you
excuse me.
would say.
Thank you for that question, because Douglass started off believing, as a disciple of William Lloyd Garrison, that the issue was fundamentally a moral spiritual one. But he got impatient with the process of how long it would take to convince people morally, spiritually, that slavery was something to be abolished. So he began to think that a political solution was a more expedient solution. He lost a lot of friends because many people then and now still that believe that pursuing political solutions is compromising with moral standards. And when you do get involved in the political process, you discover that you do have to compromise. You do have to give and take. And so he was accused of being a sellout because he got involved in the political change. But he was inconsistent, because when many people in the South began to leave the South during the latter part of Reconstruction, there was a movement called the Kansas Exodus. And many people left the South because now the Ku Klux Klan was ascendant and people were leaving in droves. And he told them, you should stay and change from within. And people called him a hypocrite. You got out, you left. And so And it was so unpopular, his position on staying in and doing the work, that he was invited to a conference and he chose not to go because he was afraid he was going to be booed. And, and so by the time he became this man of property and standing, he seemed to represent the establishment. And in fact, when he went back to the Eastern Shore, he was highly critical of the locals because he felt they were uneducated, they were unsophisticated. And so many people accused him of being a sellout. But then by the end of his life, he began to believe that it was important that you take on the system, and he started accusing openly the government after he returned from Africa. And he started to, and he would not even, he was asked to represent the United States in the 1892 World Fair in Chicago, and he refused. He refused, he said, because they had exhibitions in that exhibition that was so racist. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he joined up with Paul Laurence Dunbar and Ida B. Wells and passed out pamphlets against lynching. I mean, he got so active because he was inspired by the young who were respectful with him. And he started to become very, very critical about a whole range of issues. But he still believed that in the end, you have to work with people that are not all together with you morally, because you can't get everything. But he really believed that ultimately, in answer to the question that came earlier, that fundamentally people had to embrace the moral, spiritual nature of fundamental change. It had to be a combination of both. And that's what many people are resistant today, the recognition that people's hearts have to be moved. That's not enough to have a policy. You have to literally believe that other people's children are your children, that this country is part of one world. And that interdependence is many people in this country are still struggling to accept. But the world is moving on. It's coming together where people like it or not. It's coming together. And he saw that as long ago as the 1840s and 50s. Yes.
Yes. I'm a member of the Metropolitan AME Church.
Okay.
Where Frederick Douglass attended his funeral was.
Yes.
And also his home here, I guess it's Hickory.
Yes.
Did you talk about any of those two things?
Oh, of course,
Okay.
Because he was smart enough as a man to discover that Washington, D.C. was a place that the black middle class was moving into. And so he bought property. So he invested in Washington, D.C. property. And because of that investment, he was able to buy homes for his children, and also to buy an estate, which is now in outside of Washington, D.C., overlooking the Capitol. But that house overlooking the Capitol only exists because his second wife was determined that house would be a memorial to her second husband, because his children wanted to sell that house and have the profits of that sale. But they contested her. The will gave everything to her, and she won. And so that house is maintained just exactly as he left it. And Rochester, he's buried there. He's buried there. On one side of his grave is his first wife, Anna, and then the other side is the grave of his second wife, Helen.
But his funeral was here.
His funeral was at the AME Church, which thousands came, and the funeral itself went on for hours. And the family, Douglas's family, sat on one side, and Helen sat alone on the other, because they would not have anything to do with her. And when the time came, the family secretly removed their mother's body from Washington to bring it to Rochester. And she had nothing, she didn't know anything about it. But the Reverend Grimke of that church married Helen and Frederick. And so it was a very prominent church in his life.
And the bottom is Douglas Hall.
Yes, yes. And so there are all these things I want to see, and my visit here to Washington.
Maybe we should go to the church.
Yeah. Thank you for suggesting that. Yes. And one more question because I'm seeing the look from Nicole that time is almost up. This is my favorite part. So, do you have a question? Because you look so.
I'm just totally interested because I don't know much.
Yes.
And it's a lot of learning.
Yes. Well, I think that you, if you read the book, I hope that it'll inspire you to learn more. Because I'm once a teacher, always a teacher. I taught history, and I was on a mission as a history teacher to teach the history that was not in the books. I remember the first time I heard about something that was not in the books, and I was enraged when I am a junior in history, and I didn't know that there was internment camps during World War II. And I said, what else are they leaving out of the books? And so we form our history by what we know, a sense of identity by what we know. And so therefore, I'm committed that my role is to tell the untold stories so that people will have a fuller picture of themselves. And the power of history is such that we have a cause called the lost cause, where people still are holding on more than 100 years later to the lies of the Civil War. We're not even supposed to mention slavery. Whereas in the secession documents of every state that seceded from the Union, they unequivocally said, we're leaving because of slavery. And then when the Constitution was created for the Confederacy, they forbade the states to free slaves independently. So it was all about slavery. And my last comment, I hope my book is banned. Because that would bring more attention to the book. And I have a T-shirt that says "Read banned books." And my last quote that I want.
What does the t-shirt say? Sorry.
What?
What does the t-shirt?
The T-shirt said "Read banned books." And the last one that I would like a quote is from a quote from a bookstore in Portland, and it says, "Just because it's fiction doesn't mean it's not true." Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight for this fabulous